want to begin by talking about a fundamental fallacy in the discussion of the opening up of the economy. People are anxious to get back to work. People are very much suffering because of the inability to carry out day-to-day functions, especially without work. You don't have income coming in. The money from the government is not adequate to cover what used to be wages. And the lockdown is taking a very intense toll, not just on the economy, but psychologically. But there's a problem with the way it's being approached, which is that the idea that if you just reopened businesses, everything would be fine. I discussed this somewhat yesterday, but I want to go at it again today to talk about this whole idea of the V-shaped economy, the V-shaped upturn. Now, there are some things that are being done that are necessary and useful. The War Production Act, or the citing of the Defense Production Act, to open some industries to do necessary work, whether it's producing protective equipment or working on vaccines or building quick emergency hospitals. This is all really urgent and necessary, but it points to something more profound. Why not do this with the upgrading and revitalization of the manufacturing sector? Now, we've seen a disintegration of manufacturing in the United States over 40 to 50 years, but especially since 2001. There are somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 million industrial jobs which were lost permanently after 2001, before the coronavirus crisis. Now, those were not being replaced. People who worked in auto plants and steel plants, in tractor and farm equipment production, many of them whose jobs were outsourced to other countries, including China. Many of them were forced to take jobs as security guards in the so-called gig economy, part-time work, 3 or 4 part-time jobs, which didn't pay as much, didn't have benefits, and so on. Now, how do you get back to an industrial recovery? Well, the principle of directed credit is what we're seeing with the way President Trump used the War Production Act and the Defense Production Act to put people to work on doing things that were necessary for public health. This is what Roosevelt did in the buildup of the American forces for World War II. Auto plants were retooled, they were reopened, new people were hired, job training was pushed ahead dramatically. People who had never worked in productive jobs were suddenly producing tanks and battleships and airplanes. Now, this is the kind of transformation that can take place. You don't need war to do it, unless the war is a war on poverty, war on colonial policy, war on central bankers manipulating credit so that it only goes to the shadow banking system. This is called the Hamiltonian policy, where you have national credit agencies, not phony central banks that operate on behalf of the private banks, like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Japan or the European Central Bank, but a national credit agency, whether it's a national bank, whether it's the Treasury, which issues credit for production and ensures that money gets through the banking system to those people who will open up businesses or retool their businesses or expand their businesses. We have to extend it to the full economy, not just to healthcare, although that's important now, but to manufacturing, to agriculture, to infrastructure, including to those areas that are scientific oriented. That is, new technologies being brought online, which is an increase in productivity, which increases the actual value of your productive process. Now, that's the solution, and LaRouche PAC just put out a program for 50 million new productive jobs in the United States as part of a commitment to 1.5 billion new jobs, productive jobs internationally. Now, the United States is not going to create jobs in other countries, but a change in the credit system, away from speculation, away from control by the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements, into a situation where national banks that are sovereign in other countries can generate credit so they can retool, so they can build infrastructure for the first time. And some of those contracts will come to American companies. So while we're rebuilding our own nation, we can play a role building up other nations that have been under the colonial influence of global central banks since their independence. That's the LaRouche Pact program. Instead, what are we seeing? Bailout of the speculators by the Federal Reserve. Will that produce a V-shaped recovery? Well, for the stock market, we've already seen the stock market going up. But the stock market is not a reflection of the real physical economy. In fact, the stock market has gone through a series of bubbles since 1987. And the most recent example is 2009. We just saw the lunacy of Joe Biden, who's the Federal Witness Protection Plan presidential candidate hiding out in his basement, saying he's going to take the expertise he had in 2009 in recovering from the last recession to bring it today. What expertise? Building bubbles? Blowing bubbles? Is that what Biden's doing in his basement, blowing bubbles? Well, if he were to come in and do that, or if we were to allow Jerome Powell to make quantitative easing a permanent policy, QE to infinity, then what you'll get is another bubble which will blow up at some point. And all it does is increase the total volume of debt on the American people. Corporate debt, government debt, private sector debt. A consumer recovery based on credit cards is not a real recovery. You need wages that cover the actual cost of living. And you can't get that in a service economy. You can only get it through a return to the principles of physical economy. So don't be suckered into believing that a stock market bubble is a recovery. To break with the British financial system, the City of London, Wall Street financial system, which has caused the economic crisis that put us into this situation. Instead, we have LaRouche's new Bretton Woods policy based on a four powers agreement, which in conjunction with the four laws of LaRouche, of banking separation, of Hamiltonian credit, of infrastructure investment, and of science and technology investment, that's how we could create 50 million new productive jobs in the United States without having to go to war, without pouring billions or trillions into the pockets of the corrupt swindlers of the military-industrial complex, without bailing out the swindlers of Wall Street, who are the ones who create these bubbles. So think about it. And go to our website and read up on our program. We're going to have a pamphlet out very soon. And I would encourage you to look at it, study it, and become an advocate for the LaRouche Pact plan for the restoration of the world economy.